Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends. First of all, I would like to say that it's a great pleasure and a great honor for me to welcome Professor N. Deighton from Wolfson College, University of Oxford, at University in Prague, Charles University, in this hall, so-called Karolina. We are really pleased that her lecture, strictly speaking, Bruce Lockhart Annual Lecture, will be delivered in this patriotic hall of Karolina, in this special place with a long and famous history this year. The title of lecture is very, very actual, because Professor Deighton will speak about history and present of Euro-British relations. However, before the lecture, I would like to give a floor to Dr. Vít Smetana from the Institute of Contemporary History of Akademie, of Czech Academy of Sciences, and ask him for a small introduction.
Thank you very much, Martin, for the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, like so many times in history, also in 2016, the eyes of the Europeans are fixed on the United Kingdom. It is not a coincidence that the potentially fateful referendum will take place in Britain. To understand the inducements and incentives for this risky step, one really has to look into the history of difficult relationship between the Britain, United Kingdom on the one hand and Europe, whether it was European Community or European Union on the other. I'm truly pleased and honored for having this wonderful opportunity to welcome here on the soil of the Charles University, really, in my view, the best expert on this topic, and at the same time, my lifelong mentor and also very good friend. N. Deighton has served for long years as a professor of European international politics and also fellow at St. Antony's and later Wolfson College. She has published extensively on the history of the Cold War, the historical development of European integration, post-Cold War security, and British foreign policy. Out of her numerous publications, I would mention at least the monograph, The Impossible Peace, Britain, the Division of Germany and the Origins of the Cold War, which went out in 1993. Her co-authorship of the Cambridge History of the Cold War, several collective monographs that she edited on the history of the Western European Union, for example, and numerous other topics, and almost uncountable number of contributions to the most prestigious academic journals on contemporary history as well as international relations. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the British Czech-Slovak Historians Forum, I am truly happy that the lectures given in previous years by Mike Cornwall and Richard Overy, after them the third Bruce Lockhart lecture will be devoted to this very current topic, the topic of Britain and Europe, and that it will be given by N. Deighton. N, please.
Vice-Chancellor, colleagues, friend Vít, and attendees here, I'm so honored to be giving this Bruce Lockhart lecture this year. It's been a long time in the planning, and even as we were planning this lecture, the British government took to its heels and decided that there was going to be a referendum. This referendum is planned for the 23rd of June, and it has become the source of the most intense political debate that I can remember in my time as a scholar of international relations. It's become an intense political debate for reasons connected with Europe, but also for reasons connected with Britain, British identity, and unfortunately, for the relationship between the major political parties in the UK and relations within those parties, which is a very polite way of saying it has become an extremely dirty campaign. And the citizen in me is very upset, I have to say, that we should be conducting our relations with the EU as an institution and with our friends with whom we've built careful bilateral relations and multilateral relations over so many years, decades, and indeed centuries. It should have come to this rather foolish set of events. But there we are. That is life. And we as historians know all too well that we have to live with the imperfect world in which we find ourselves, and from that try to craft a narrative, an argument, and perhaps the beginning of an explanation. So I have 3 tasks today. Is this all right? Can you hear? All right. There's no feedback. Good. I want first to show a little bit of the record of the United Kingdom and its relationship with the European community over time. And this will include the last time that we had a referendum on the EU. It was called the European Community at the time, but I will call it Union. Because we did have a referendum before in 1975. And I think as historians, we are very keen to know if there are any lessons we can learn from it. In this first task of mine, I have one core argument, and that is the world may have changed substantially over the last 70 years. But there are very strong threads of continuity in the way the British do their politics. And this may be one of our problems. The second thing I want to do is to talk a little bit about the referendum campaign today. And as I've explained already, this is quite a painful exercise for me. And I should be very interested to hear your interpretations of what we are doing. And I have a very specific reason for this. Because the day after tomorrow, I shall be in a panel with our Vice-Chancellor, Mr. Vice-Chancellor, with our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Louise Richardson in Oxford, and also with our Chancellor, Lord Chris Patten, where we will be discussing in St. Anthony's College the referendum campaign. And one of the factors that is of most interest to us as scholars is how you see us. So I shall be collecting ideas from you. So if you wish an instant megaphone to the centres of power in Oxford, this is your moment to speak. The third thing I will do is to try and reflect a little on what is actually going on. We can talk about polls, we can talk about class, we can talk about British politics and the state of the European Union, but what is actually happening? And that is the task that historians always have, to explain themselves not only to each other, but to the wider world. So to go to my first point, I should just like, before we start, to show you some of our rogues gallery. From left to right, you have Mr. Winston Churchill, Mr. Clement Attlee, Ernie Bevin, Foreign Secretary under the Labour government, going round in a circle, Mr. Harold Wilson, Jim Callaghan, Foreign Secretary, then Prime Minister, and on the left, Harold Macmillan. In the middle is Edward Heath, who is the Prime Minister who took us into the European community. Now, those of you in this room who may be anthropologists, sociologists, or just plain curious, may think that you have to be a pipe or cigar smoker to become British Prime Minister. It wasn't compulsory, but as you can see, it certainly helped. And so there they all are, except for Ted Heath and beneath him, Jim Callaghan, who, if they did smoke, they didn't do so in front of the camera. So to go back to 45 when Winston Churchill is evicted from office, much to his fury, having been the victorious power that won the European war, as he said, and in his place, Clement Attlee, the balding chap with the pipe, who was accompanied by his Foreign Secretary, Ernie Bevin, on whom I'm writing at the moment. Ernie Bevin was a lad, man of the people, so he's smoking a roll-up cigarette, not a cigar. So, in 1945, was the political scientist would call a paradigm moment when the world shifted in a very important way. And for Britain, there are a number of important factors. The most important was that we were a victorious country after the Second World War. Our European partners had been invaded and defeated. Many, if not most, had lost their pre-war constitutions. We had not. We had our constitution, if you can call it such, and the form of government was intact, and so was our empire. We were one of the big four. We had a seat on the Security Council for the United Nations. We took a unilateral decision to build our own nuclear bomb. We were one of the four powers managing a defeated Germany and Austria and Berlin, along with the Soviet Union, the United States, and France. So we were in a pole position, and it was expected from others around us, not least from those in the Nordic countries as well as France, that we would have a leadership role. Now I have to say, and it is to our endless chagrin, that by 1945 we essentially abandoned Eastern Europe. The geostrategic realities of the world in 45 meant that that Iron Curtain was down, and there was no way in the short term it was going to be moved. There was no geostrategic or political imperative to try to move that. And of course, for you and for other countries behind that Iron Curtain, it's been a source of enormous loss, aggravation, and some anger. But this is how it was. And I have to say that some in Britain, at least by the early 60s, were actually quite content with the way in which Europe had divided. But even as we were doing these bits of planning, as I've shown you there, we were still running a very large empire. We were losing bits of it, it has to be said. India, the jewel in the crown, took its independence after 1947. Crown colony of Ceylon, later called Sri Lanka, became independent in 48. Palestine continued to funnel the efforts, the failed efforts of the British until 48, when they gave up, turned the issue over to the United Nations, and Israel was created. In Malaya from 45, there was a form of civil war, which we politely called the emergency, which continued for nearly 10 years. In Africa, South Africa and Egypt, countries had gone their separate ways earlier, but the Mau Mau was in the 50s in Kenya. There was trouble and then independence in the Gold Coast, which became Ghana. The list is long. The point I'm making here is that the UK did not think of itself and was not considered purely a European power. So to concentrate on Europe is to tell part of the story, not the whole story. And indeed, as the historians, distinguished historians like the Vice-Chancellor and others will know, that the tradition of the United Kingdom had been from the outside to try and balance power in Europe, to try and stand back as far as possible and throw its weight to keep a balance of power between what were considered to be potentially aggressive states on the continent. So that was the position after the war. Further, there is a cultural point that we thought of governance in terms of autonomy, independence, sovereignty. And if we worked with countries, working through forms of cooperation, not supranational integration. The Commonwealth style was that was most favoured in London, in Whitehall. The idea was we were interdependent, not federated, that we were pragmatic and would take incremental decisions collectively. We would not create blueprints for a major shift in the way the world worked. Thus, the Marshall Plan was considered the high point of cooperation, where the Americans provided the money, we provided some of the political leadership, and we divided up the proceeds between those who wanted to be involved. The Council of Europe was only acceptable when the UK insisted on an intergovernmental council to manage its decision-making. NATO, decision-making by consensus. So as you can see in the post-war building period after 45, this tends to be cooperation. Things went very badly from 1950 onwards, when the European coal and steel community, which sounds pretty grim and dull and techie, but in fact was extremely important. And then in 57, when 6 European countries decided to blend their sovereignty and to work in a different sort of way. This was the moment when the British turned their back and said no. There were some good stories about what actually happened in 1950, and it's not a very pretty story. But the long and the short of it was that we said no to this new form of integration. So we sought to be outside, balancing the continent, not to be inside as part of it. The papers in the British Foreign Office are quite disparaging. One of the main concerns was, we have just got out of a war, the European countries were defeated. What would happen if we joined them and it all failed again? We would lose our own precious constitution, is what the Permanent Under-Secretary's Committee thought. So this is the background to the integration problem that becomes the European Community and then the European Union. However, by the early 1960s, it became clear that our decision had been a bad one. It might have seemed appropriate at the time, but it was not working. The West German economy was recovering remarkably. The French economy was recovering remarkably. The Italian economy was making huge strides forward. The British economy was lagging behind. Further, the United States were beginning to look to the Germans, to the French, rather than to the British, however loudly we shouted about our special relationship. So as you can see, the Conservatives applied to join. They were vetoed by General Charles de Gaulle in 63. In 67, the Labour Party applied to join. They were vetoed once again by General Charles de Gaulle. There's a good Anglo-French story there, but that's not my theme tonight. And in 71, the Conservatives reactivate the programme. Charles de Gaulle has left office, and in the following year, we are accepted as members. So, it was a bad moment to join, but actually, it was not a good moment for the economy, because as you will know, in 73, we have the Yom Kippur War, economic distress, the collapse of the Bretton Woods system had just happened. And it seems to me that the main underpinning of integration is that if you don't have economic growth, you cannot make the integration practice work. And in the 70s, we did not have that. So, very soon after we joined, we discovered that the Labour Party started to fall out amongst itself, and we decided to have another referendum. Now, the Labour Party put forward this in their election manifesto, and manifestos are very important as a guide for politics. And the argument here is quite interesting. If British membership, that is of the EC, threatened to impoverish our working people or to destroy the authority of Parliament, then Labour could not agree. There had long been a discussion about the referendum and whether a decision by referendum would trump that of an Act of Parliament. At this time, at the end of '74, Harold Wilson decided that he had to take this issue to the people. There'd been no referendum when we joined. There had been in Denmark, which had said yes, and there had been indeed in Norway, which said no, as you know. So in '75, they held the referendum. Now, to go back to this picture, the leaders of this referendum were Harold Wilson on the bottom right-hand side of your picture, a very canny politician who was actually nearing the end of his political career. And to his right, or to your left, James Callaghan, Foreign Secretary, very Eurosceptic, who then becomes Prime Minister. It was a pretty extraordinary event. In the end, we said yes on a turnout of 65%, with a clear 67% of those saying yes. The question was, do you think the UK should stay in the European community? And one of the main campaigners to stay in was none other than this young lady in the middle of your photograph, Mrs. Margaret Thatcher, before she became Prime Minister, wearing what has to be one of the most tasteless pullovers that you have ever seen. And she must, and her advisors must have been deeply embarrassed. But the camera never lies, and the camera never goes to bed, so there it is. And you see the kind of campaigning that went on. To the right of your pictures, Brussels, the new capital of Britain, with the United Kingdom shown running away as fast as possible out into the mid-Atlantic. And to the left of your picture, support your local continent, that is Europe. So that was the way in which the campaign panned out. And in the end, we decided that we wanted to stay in. The turnout was pretty good, 65%, as I said. And the public opinion, which is very significant, turned in favour very late in the course of polling. Right up until a couple of months before the referendum, public opinion was extremely hostile. The Labour Party was divided, the Conservative Party was divided, and it wasn't really sure which way it would go. The government had negotiated technical changes, and the government in power, that's Harold Wilson, had said he wanted to stay in because he thought he'd done a good deal. But there was what was called civil war in both parties. So both parties were split in the cabinet, outside the cabinet. What is interesting is that the other member states were very supportive to try and keep Britain in particular Helmut Schmidt in Germany, who came over and gave some very important speeches to the British. And so there was a feeling that the community was a community of friends, of allies. And I think that that's quite significant when we think about today. And so the campaign in the end went that there was a lot more money, I have to say, in the in campaign than there was in the out. They thought the problem would be resolved, but it wasn't, and I will skip very quickly over the next 20 years, because the problem was not resolved for Britain. We supported the Single Act because we wanted, for ideological reasons, a flat market for trade, and therefore to get rid of barriers between countries was considered by Mrs. Thatcher to be a good thing. However, as the 80s progressed and turned into the 90s, support for the Maastricht Treaty was deeply contested. We nearly turned it down, and we got no social chapter that was removed. We had no Schengen. The Justice and Home Affairs clauses were deeply contested, and we said then and later that we would not go for the euro. So we begin to see those differentiated approaches springing to the surface again. Talk of a referendum did continue, and indeed there was talk by Tony Blair that there could be a referendum on the Constitution. But he was saved that indignity by the French and Dutch referendums, which stopped the constitutional treaty in its tracks. However, we move on now to the second part of my talk, the Conservative decision to hold a referendum this or next year. And to go back to manifestos, we historians like a primary document. This is what is in the Conservative Party manifesto of 2015. And the commitment is unavoidable. We will give you a say with an in-out referendum by the end of next year. We will not go in the Eurozone, and they use these words: we will reform the working of the EU, which is too big, untrue, too bossy, probably untrue, and too bureaucratic, certainly untrue, but there it was. And to reclaim power from Brussels on your behalf, setting up the national constituents against the continent, not with them. And the reason that this manifesto came out, and it was such a disastrous decision by Cameron, was that by this time, by 2015, the rise of a new party in the UK was making the Conservatives very worried. And this is the United Kingdom Independence Party, which is known by its acronym as UKIP. And Cameron was seriously frightened that at the next election, UKIP might split the Conservative Party. And therefore, he borrowed the emperor's clothes. He made this promise, if the Conservatives got in, that they would have a referendum. And of course, what happened is UKIP returned no MPs at all. Because of our voting system, they had 13% of the vote, which is a high percentage, but they had no MPs whatsoever. Even their beer-drinking, cigarette-smoking, so he's in training for Prime Minister, cigarette-smoking Farage, Nigel Farage, did not get returned in the seat where he had campaigned in Thanet, East Kent. So it's a problem that we have now. I have to say that the Labour Party also did not say there would be a referendum, but they certainly flirted with the ideas. They would legislate for a lock, i.e. to cause a break on integration. And so if there were any more transfer of powers, there would have to be consent of the British public through an in-out referendum. And actually, that is quite often forgotten. So what happened? Cameron then went off to Brussels in the same way that Harold Wilson had gone in 1974-75 to negotiate, and you will recognize Tusk and Juncker, rather tense looking. I think the anthropologists would enjoy that picture of the three of them discussing over this table, and Cameron looking very tense, and this very awful photograph of them all at the European Council meeting, where Cameron negotiates what he considers are good technical terms to allow us to stay in the Union because the European Union will accept them. The most important of these, to my mind as a historian, is that there will be no more political union for the British. And there were many technical things about sovereignty and migrant welfare payments, but that was the bottom line, i.e. the buck stops with Cameron. So he came back full of delight. This is what I asked for, this is what I got, and this is where we are now. So how is it panning out in the UK? Well, first of all, the cabinet is split. As you know, Michael Gove has left, Ian Duncan Smith has left. So the cabinet, the decision-making executive core of the United Kingdom governance system has divided, and the party is campaigning against each other. Now, there's been a lot of talk in the domestic press about the fact that both David Cameron and Boris Johnson, who is effectively leading the Out campaign, the Brexit campaign, are both from the same public school, both went to the same university. And the trouble is that Cameron is 5 years younger than Johnson, and also a good few, nearly a quarter of a metre taller than Johnson. So there's a lot of personal animosity here, which I think is probably extremely undignified. However, Johnson might like to be Prime Minister. As somebody once said to me, oh my God, just imagine next December, Donald Trump as Prime Minister, as President of the United States, Boris Johnson as Prime Minister of the UK. Just imagine if those two gentlemen stand side by side and the wind blows a gale. We will be in a sea of blowing white and blonde hair. So the cartoonists are going to town on this particular issue. Parties are split. The Labour Party has, to its credit, managed more or less to stay within the fold. But UKIP is active. It's going to be more active over the next few weeks. And many of the smaller parties are joining in this debate. It is panning out differently in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and in different parts of the UK. The Remain campaign, it has been using economic arguments, and they are now upping the ante to use more political and strategic arguments. The Brexiteers, as they're called, the Leave campaign, had started with the economy, but it is clear the economy would be affected. So they've left that and they have shifted to migration. And migration is a deeply contentious issue everywhere in Europe at the moment. It is potentially explosive, but that's where we've got to. So it's about interests as well as about citizenship. The question that's been asked is, should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union, or should it leave? And I brought, in case anyone was interested, every householder in the UK was sent one of these, the 2016 EU Referendum Voting Guide. All you need to know in 8 pages, which takes you through how to register, 1 page to stay in and 1 page to leave, and then how the ballot paper will look. So this is the sort of handout that's gone to all the voters in the referendum. It's a very close-run thing. We think, insofar as we can gauge from the polling, that age really matters, that young people are far more in favour of staying in the European Union than people over 60. This is extremely important, and it may really matter on the day of voting. It seems that the campaign and its leadership has had very little effect on the polls, which I will show you in a minute. Both sides have split leaderships. That is to say, there is an official Remain, an official Leave campaign, but there are many different groups supporting one side or the other. And the lack of coordination has meant that many actually voters are beginning to get a bit fed up with the whole thing. It's been a very long campaign. And we are not sure whether this, in certain parts of the country, is about nationalism, Scottish nationalism, Northern Irish nationalism, independence, and where the argument about socialism and conservatism has gone. Now, if you can see this, this is a poll of polls over the last nearly 6 months. And the detail really doesn't matter, and it hasn't changed much since I put this up as a PowerPoint slide. What is important is that things aren't moving. The only substantial shift has been a drift down from 17% to about 13% of undecided voters. Otherwise, it seems that whatever happens isn't making much impact on the polls whatsoever, because those undecided people are going both ways. They're not just going to remain or to leave. This means that, for example, the intervention of President Obama has had no effect, and it had no effect at all. As a historian, I rather suspected this would happen. The British don't like to be told what to do by the Americans. They like the feeling to be there as part of their own world picture, and this is exactly what happened. But the tone of the campaign is not good. It's not good. The different leaders, and at the top left you have the new Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who has been very, very unpopular in many circles, but has actually kept his party together thus far. Next to him, David Cameron, whom you will recognise. That rather obscure-looking gentleman, who is the new Liberal Democrat leader, is called Tim Farron, and you may not have heard of him because his profile is almost non-existent. And then you have Nicola Sturgeon, who is the leader of the SNP in Scotland, who is in a difficult position. If the Scots find that the United Kingdom has voted to leave, there is a very clear possibility that the Scots may demand a different referendum with a view to independence once again, and the Scots staying in the European Union. The polling in Scotland is quite difficult to read, and so Sturgeon hasn't actually committed herself irrevocably one way or the other. And then you have Arlene Forster for the DUP in Northern Ireland, and they have voted, they want their supporters to vote to leave. And the reason for that is that many Protestants in Northern Ireland, and this is where it starts to get very complicated, many Protestants in Northern Ireland feel that being in the European Union with ERA, with Southern Ireland, has meant that the prospects of Irish unification are becoming closer. Now, if Britain and Northern Ireland were to leave the Union, the argument of the Protestants is that it would be far less likely that there would be a united Ireland. So you begin to see different kinds of arguments being fed in to this extremely difficult debate. So if you read in the Financial Times, you'll find it's a pro paper. I'm sure some of you read the Financial Times. If you read quite a lot of the popular press, the Daily Mail, the Sun, the Daily Express, these papers are viciously opposed to staying in the European Union. And they are the mass circulation papers, the equivalent of, say, Bild in Germany. So they are very much in favour of getting out, and they use all the classic arguments. Too many migrants, not enough control, too expensive, we can run it ourselves better. The Times and the Telegraph are more moderately, but also in favour of leaving, which leaves the Guardian. And the Independent was another paper that was quite pro-EU, but it's closed down. And the Financial Times in favour. So in the mass market of journalism, there's only the Daily Mirror, which is a mass newspaper in favour of staying in. So that's a very complicated bit of the debate. We don't know the correlation between readers of these newspapers and actual votes. So I go back to this question of who actually pitches up to vote. So the similarities between 75 and today for us are considerable, and I don't want to spend much time on them because it's a very British issue. But the government in power in both cases has wanted to stay in. They've presented technical conditions for a renegotiation. But the government in power is split. And both political parties are split, though the Labour has controlled this splitting so far by keeping a fairly low profile. In both occasions, our EU member states, our friends in the European Union, are publicly supportive of the UK's staying in. However, there are big differences. And it seems to me that the biggest one is that we are far more integrated into the European Union than we were in 75. It's a much bigger decision. We have the UKIP, and we do not know how UKIP voting will pan out when it actually comes to the referendum on and beyond. The regions are more complicated now than they were in 75, and social media is becoming a huge matter of attempts to control by all parties. And then we have the other great issue, which was not an issue in 75, which is that of migration. And it is toxic. In Britain, it is toxic here in the Czech Republic, I understand. I think it is toxic in every continental European state at the moment. Now, it raises huge racial, integrative, and employment issues for everybody. But migration, of course, is not one phenomenon. There are many phenomena. And the refugee, humanitarian aspect of migration is something that's on people's minds. However, the migration that is worrying those within the UK is of those people who have come to the United Kingdom, and in total they come up to well over 2.5 million people, nearly 3, to work and earn their way in the UK. And for reasons which are very hard to fathom, they have become the butt of hostility. Because it is argued they will work for lower wages, that they are a drain on education, they are a drain on the health system. The evidence for this is very, very thin. But it's become a trope, a part of the discussion within the UK, which makes it very, very hard to handle. And I have to say, and it's very difficult to say this, it's almost a proxy for another bigger debate that links to the end of empire. And that is that the largest wave of migration into the United Kingdom is not actually from the European Union at all, it's post-imperial migration from the empire, from the Commonwealth. This issue is currently untouchable. After Enoch Powell's 71 speech about rivers of blood, this is an issue where people cannot go, but it is not far from the surface, which is why those who are worried about social cohesion are very, very concerned about this. And incidentally, those coloured immigrants in the UK who've been polled are very strongly in favour of staying in the EU. So they are reading very carefully what is going on. So, to look ahead. Historians don't like looking ahead. It's the job of the political scientists to tell us what may happen, but in this case, I think that we have to. I don't know. On a good day, I think that in the end, common sense will prevail. On a bad day, I think common sense will not prevail. I think if we stay in, there will be consequences, both for Britain and for the EU. June the 24th will not be like June the 23rd. I think it's extremely likely that the Conservative Party could split. There are a hard core of those who want to leave, who have said so much that it's going to be very hard for the Conservative Party to reconfigure itself. Now that raises a lot of issues about that relationship with UKIP and whether we may find the creation of a rather more right-wing nationalist party on the right of the political spectrum. Secondly, I think remaining, or leaving, but remaining, will actually create a precedent for other countries. And it has been discussed in East Central Europe, but also in France and Italy, that perhaps they too should have a referendum, that the people, the popular vote, should be consulted in this way. Thirdly, I think that there will have to be reforms in the European Union. I think that most close observers of the Union think that we've got to try and do certain things in a different way. We've never quite come to grips with the problem of living at 28 with a structure which was actually constructed basically in 1950. The core constitutional structure of the Union hasn't ended. Don't ask me how I'd reform it, because I don't think I know, and I don't think anybody knows. And we may land up reinventing the same thing all over again. But there is clearly a problem there for the EU. And then lastly, I think that we will have a price to pay with our allies. I think those countries that have supported us have made things very complicated. We in Britain have become part of the problem rather than being there to help the European Union deal with the problems of the Eurozone, of migration, of declining indigenous populations and rising migrating populations, of further enlargement, of Ukraine, of Putin. Instead of really being able to be part of a union that tries to help mediate these problems, we have ourselves become another problem. And I think if we stay in, I think that we will have a price to pay with our allies, and it won't just be saying thank you. If we leave, I think the Conservative Party will certainly split. And I think it's very likely that David Cameron, he says he won't resign, but I think he would resign. I think there will be a problem for the Labour Party as well, because Corbyn has committed himself to staying in, and this may produce other frictions about other aspects of him as a leader. The commercial options for the UK have been rehearsed till we're all blue in the face. Basically, if we want to shut down migration totally, we will not be able to be part of the single market. That is the bottom line. The single market goes with the free movement of labour. You can tweak it, but you can't end it. So it looks increasingly as though, in terms of our trading options, we have to find something that will be specific to the UK, or we will just have to negotiate through WTO agreements and make our own bilateral trading agreements. It will not be possible to be part of the single market, as I understand it, and even those who want to leave say this, if we do not want to sign up to the labour issues. So that's only a small question, isn't it? We may not have our regular trading partners. There will be huge consequences for Ireland, because Southern Ireland, the Southern Irish economy is very dependent upon the British economy, and for the UK regions. And then there might be a demand for a second referendum in Scotland, which could itself, over time, and I'm talking about 10, 15 years, lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom. We will have to reconfigure many policy areas. As you know, agriculture is 80–90% dealt with in Brussels now. That will have to be renationalised. Higher education, upon which I'm sure Charles University and all universities depend enormously for research funding, for Erasmus, for mobility between universities, that will all have to be revisited, and it will be very expensive. The security and strategic consequences I find particularly interesting. There is an argument that we have NATO and therefore we do not need the European Union. My own view is that whether you look west towards relations with the United States, north to relations with the Nordic countries, east to relations with Ukraine and Russia, and south on the southern flank, the Mediterranean littoral, the Middle East, and beyond globally, that in terms of security, we have gone a long way to build a system in which the European Union does the soft diplomacy, the soft power, and NATO is the sort of backup. I have to say, Donald Trump has asked what is the point of NATO. So if we take away NATO from that equation, we find ourselves in an extraordinarily insecure position. I think there could also be what I call a snowball effect, that if we start to think we can leave institutions and let's look around and see what is the point of other institutions, I think there could really be serious problems for the structuring and the effectiveness of NATO. We don't know. There's reassuring words coming out, but there are some very worrying trends coming out, not least the cyclical trend of NATO of the Americans not to want to focus on Europe, but to use their diplomatic and military power much more globally than with us. So, the consequences are pretty devastating. I mean, I think we'd survive, but I don't think it'd be a lot of fun. For anybody, and not within the Union as well as outside. Let me just think, as to wind up, if I may, just for 5 minutes. The wider conclusion, what is actually going on here? Is this a party political spat which has horrible consequences beyond the party? Or is there something far more deep-seated? I think you will realize that, as a historian, I think that this is actually a very important moment. As I hope I've been able to show, I think there's a deep-seated political, cultural issue in the United Kingdom about supranational integration and the development of the European Union. We have tried within the European Union to favour enlargement at the expense of deepening, by and large. That has been the kind of balancing we've tried to do. Tried to have a wider, more cooperative arrangement. We were one of the lead countries in favour of enlargement to the east eventually, far more than the French, for example. But that it could be under threat. It hasn't been very satisfactory for many in Britain either. Within Britain, as in other countries, there is a deep discontent with elites and with the political classes. Whether it's small issues like our local members of parliament quite often fiddling their pay and expenses, had huge coverage. The feeling that we can't actually trust those people whom we used to trust in the past. And that is amplified out to Brussels. We don't know these people. I think if you showed a picture of Tusk or even of Juncker to 95% of the British population, they wouldn't have the faintest idea of who the picture was of. A poll that was done recently of the most trusted man in the United Kingdom came up with somebody who you've probably never heard of, who is a man called Martin Lewis, who runs the radio's How to Save Your Money program. It's called Moneybox, and he tells you what to invest in, what not to invest in, and he was the most trusted man in Britain. Well, we've got a real problem with our political classes if that is the case. So I think that there is a real problem, and I think it's going to require political management of the highest level to deal with that. I don't think it's a specifically British problem, but it has very, very acute resonances in Britain because of our imperial and other history. And I think, secondly, the consequences of adapting to loss of empire. I don't think we have been as good as we thought we had. My own view is that as we lost empire, we thought we should be leaders. And if you go back to Tony Blair, his obsession with leadership was quite extraordinary. And you'll still find, especially Tory MPs, who will say we must stay in because we have to lead the European Union. It's a phrase that keeps creeping back into the discourse in Britain. So we haven't really dealt with empire yet, in my way, but I don't think that any country has fully dealt with the end of empire, which takes me to the end of the Cold War. Of course, the European Union was an institution designed in its Cold War context. It made a stuttering attempt in the first 10 years after the end of the Cold War to see how it could manage, and then eventually went for enlargement along with NATO. It may be that we need to look very closely at how we do manage our events. I was one of those in the late 1990s who was actually in favour of moving much closer to Russia in terms of partnership and association agreements, but we seem to have lost that for now. Then you come to this question that always has to be here, globalized politics. Is it that the lowest common denominator of politics is now populism? Is it social media, the divergence between the elite classes and those who have not done so well out of globalization? Is this what we're dealing with? And it takes curious forms. And in the UK, it's taken the form of hostility to the European Union. Incidentally, there's no hostility to NATO at all. And then I conclude by wondering whether, in fact, our leaders, at least in the UK, aren't actually as confused as their voters. We really have had a very poor explanation of what it is we're voting on, what it means for us as British citizens, and what it may mean for citizens across the European Union if we decide to leave or even if we stay. I think that many of our leaders are confused. We seem to be in an age of reactive politics. We react to events, whether it's Crimea, Ukraine, we react to events in Syria, Libya, and beyond, rather than acting preemptively to try and forestall crises before they literally, in the case of migration, literally hit our borders. Now, Bruce Lockhart, whose memory is reflected in these lectures today, said that the Czechs were a highly democratically inclined peoples with very high levels of educational aspiration and attainment. I can only hope that we in Britain have the same sort of values and that we will be able, as Brits, to work out our relations with East Central Europe after the 23rd of June. Thank you very much.